Hey guys, hey guys. Just want to get on here and make a simple distinction um, between what happens to be a moral crime and what amounts to a legal crime. And it's very important to make the distinction between moral and legal crimes. And just because something happens to be a moral crime or a legal crime doesn't necessarily mean that it's a moral crime. And just because it's a moral crime doesn't necessarily mean that it's a legal crime. It's a very important distinction to make between moral and legal crimes. Again, just because it's a moral crime doesn't mean that it's a legal crime. And just because it's a legal crime doesn't mean that it's a moral crime. And people often fail to make that distinction. They'll assume that that which is a legal crime, if committed, becomes a moral one, and that that which is a moral crime should necessarily be a legal crime. Now, the problem is morality is very subjective, and so we can't necessarily say what is a moral crime. And not every moral crime happens to be a legal crime. Not every legal crime happens to be a moral crime. But it's even more interesting to consider the question of whether something is a legal crime, but not a moral crime. And it's certainly possible that something can be considered a legal crime, but not a moral crime. And so it's a very important distinction to make when we're trying to think about something. Now, I was thinking about, I don't know if anyone has, seen the show Breaking Bad, but this question of moral relativism is a huge part of the show, and it's one of the things that makes it so fascinating to watch. And why people love it so much is it plays with this question of, yeah, most people would deem this to be a bad thing, but are there reasons that would justify the doing of a bad thing? And is it always clear that a legal crime is a moral crime, and that moral crimes should necessarily be legal ones? And so it's a very interesting show. If you haven't seen it, I would really recommend that you watch it, especially if you appreciate shows that toy around with the idea of moral relativism. I'm watching it right now, so that's kind of what inspired the video. But in any case, it's an old show, but it stands the test of time. In any case, I was thinking about his actions. I was thinking about, he's a meth cook, and I was thinking to myself, certainly manufacturing that particular substance is a legal crime, but I had to ask myself whether it's a moral crime necessarily, just because it's a legal crime. And I can't think of the legitimate reasons why I would consider the manufacturing of the substance itself does not seem to me to necessarily be a moral crime. And also, it's not always illegal. With any rule, there are exceptions. So, with regard to the manufacturing of methamphetamine, it's not always a legal crime. It just depends on in what context you're manufacturing it and under what motive, and for what purpose, right? Generally speaking, though, the kind of manufacturing he's engaging in is a legal crime. That goes without saying. But regardless, it's still an interesting question. So, yeah, I mean, you could be manufacturing methamphetamine for research purposes, and if it's being synthesized rather for that purpose, then right, there's a difference between synthesis and manufacturing. If it's being synthesized for research, that's a context in which there'd be an exception to the rule. If it's being manufactured for recreational use, then it becomes a legal crime. Now, the question that arises in the show, at the core of the whole show, the moral quandary at the core of the whole show is, yeah, he commits a legal crime. Does that mean that it's a moral one? And that he's immoral for committing a legal crime? And is a legal crime necessarily a moral crime? And when it comes to the manufacturing of methamphetamine within the context of the show, I had to ask myself, as I think a lot about ethics and why we consider certain things wrong, and under what logic we consider certain things right. And um, I, you know, in the abstract, can't find a legitimate reason in principle why the manufacturing of methamphetamine, even for recreational purposes, whether or not I think it should be a legal crime is a different question, right? Because that gets into utilitarianism and externalities and whether I think that we should limit the manufacturing of particular substances because we should limit their use because they have they could have potentially negative externalities on the wider social, wider society. Now, that's separate from whether I think it's a moral crime. I may think that there's utility in criminalizing the manufacture or the possession or the use of the substance without thinking that it's a moral crime to use it. I just say that it should be a legal one from a utilitarian perspective. Now, interestingly, with the question of methamphetamine manufacturing, it's, is manufacturing it? We know it's a legal crime. That's without question. But is it a moral crime? Is the question at the core of the show? If done, and in his case, I mean, it goes deeper. That's the general question at the core of the plot. But one has to really be skeptical of any immediate answer that they might come to with respect to that question. And since often ethics is very situational, and I would say that I'm a situational ethicist, we have to ask if the manufacturing of that particular substance is necessarily a moral crime. Now, I had a hard time coming up with any reason why it should necessarily be considered a moral crime in any absolute sense. I might think that it should be illegal for utilitarian reasons, but there's no reason in principle that I think I would regard it as an ethical violation of some kind to manufacture or even use the substance. Right? Now, here's the thing. This is why I come to the conclusion that he did ultimately commit a moral crime, because I don't want to go too deeply into this because this is a very specific situation with regard to the manufacture of a substance like that or the use of it. And in the context of the show, that's kind of the situation we're trying to examine the ethics behind. In any case, if we would regard using a substance like that as immoral, then manufacturing it we would also probably have to regard as immoral as well. We'd have to extend our principles to related objects, right, that they might also apply to. And so, regardless, I just in this live stream wanted to make the distinction between ask the question, right? I mean, make the distinction between moral and legal crimes, and ask, I guess, the audience to play with the possibility that you could certainly have a legal crime that is not necessarily a moral crime. In any case, thank you for watching.